That morning, at the Westfield Classic Car Auction, no one looked at Lucas Hartley for more than 2 seconds. He arrived in work clothes, still carrying faint traces of engine oil, one hand holding a folded event program marked in pencil, the other holding the small hand of a 7-year-old girl wearing a t-shirt printed with a cartoon gear set. When Lucas raised his paddle and bid $500 on the rusted, immobile 1967 Mustang shoved into the far corner of the hall, laughter broke out from the VIP section. Isabella Crane, CEO of Crane Automotive Group, looked directly at him and spoke just loudly enough for the entire room to hear. $500? What are you going to do with a pile of scrap grow flowers in it? 30 days later, the entire city fell silent. Don't look away, because what Lucas did with that car will make you question everything you thought you knew about a man in oil-stained clothes. The Westfield Classic Car Auction was the kind of event that wore its wealth like a second skin. Held every year at the Westfield Convention Hall on the eastern edge of Ashford, it drew collectors, dealers, and automotive investors from 3 states. The hall smelled of leather polish and money. Men in tailored suits sipped champagne near velvet ropes. Women in heels checked their phones between lots. At the front of the room, 2 auctioneers in matching blazers kept the energy precise and controlled, the way people manage things when everyone present can afford to be patient. Lucas stood near the side aisle, not the VIP section. He had a folding chair but wasn't using it. Grace sat on his shoulders instead, her small sneakers resting against his chest, her eyes moving from car to car as each lot was wheeled out under the spotlights. She had a program too, her own copy, which she had been annotating with a purple marker since they arrived. "That one has a crack in the headlight," she said, pointing at a 1959 Chevrolet being pushed past. "Good eye," Lucas said quietly. He wasn't here for the Chevrolet. He wasn't here for the 1963 Corvette that sold for $62,000 in the third lot, or the Jaguar E-Type that drew a standing ovation when the winning bid hit $90,000. Lucas had come for the last item on the program, Lot 22. He had penciled a small circle around it 3 days earlier when he first read the catalog description, and his hand had been steady when he did it. The auctioneer's voice grew noticeably less enthusiastic as the floor crew pushed Lot 22 into position. The car came in on a rolling platform rather than under its own power, because it had no power to offer. The 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback had been sitting in a storage unit in rural Kentucky for an estimated 22 years. Its paint had peeled away in wide strips, exposing patches of gray primer and bare metal beneath. The front bumper was cracked and partially detached. The windshield had a diagonal fracture running from the lower left corner to the upper right. The interior, what was visible through the window glass, had been partially consumed by moisture and time. The auctioneer ran through the vehicle report in a flattened tone, the way someone reads a list of things that have gone wrong with a property no one expects to sell. Several people in the front rows stood and stretched. A few moved toward the exit. Sebastian Voss, seated 3 chairs to the left of Isabella Crane in the VIP section, leaned over and murmured something. Isabella glanced at the Mustang on the platform and then looked away, back toward her phone. Lucas looked at the car and did not look away. The opening bid was $200. The hall was quiet. The auctioneer repeated the figure, and the quiet continued. Then Lucas raised his paddle. $500, he said. The auctioneer paused. "Sir, the opening is $200. You can start there if you'd like." $500, Lucas said again. Grace patted the top of his head. "Did we get it, Dad?" Sebastian Voss laughed first. Not a quiet laugh, but the kind that invites other people to join. A few of them did. And then Isabella Crane, without turning her head all the way toward Lucas, spoke the line that would follow her for the next 30 days. $500? What are you going to do with a pile of scrap grow flowers in it? The laughter in the VIP section was not cruel in the way schoolyard cruelty is cruel. It was the laughter of people who had never needed to think carefully about $500, and who could not imagine a reason to spend it on something that would require dragging it off the property. It was dismissal dressed as amusement. Lucas did not look at Isabella. He looked at Grace, who had not fully understood the laughter, but had understood her father's face, which remained calm and almost still. So she stayed calm too, She trusted his face more than she trusted the room. The gavel came down. Lucas Hartley was the new owner of the 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, Lot 22, for $500. 8 years earlier, Lucas had been the head of restoration at Hollowell Classic Works, the most respected classic car restoration workshop on the East Coast. The firm's clients included private collectors whose names appeared in business magazines, a national museum that called twice a year, and 2 international auction houses that requested Hollowell's documentation to support provenance claims. Lucas had started there at 22 as a junior technician and had risen to lead the restoration department before his 30th birthday. His colleagues called him the doctor not because he was formal, but because he could listen to an engine run for 45 seconds and tell you what was wrong with it before he opened the hood. He left on a Tuesday in March, 4 years before the Westfield auction. His wife Claire had been killed in a car accident on the interstate outside Providence on a Saturday night when Grace was 3 years old. For 11 months after that, Lucas kept working, kept driving the 2 hours to the Hollowell workshop, kept coming home after dark to a daughter who needed a father who was fully present and getting a version of him that was mostly functional and sometimes hollow. It was Grace who made the decision, in the way that children make decisions without knowing they are making them, by needing more of him than the road could spare. He found a position at a smaller garage on the west side of Ashford. The work was honest and uncomplicated. He fixed what needed fixing, charged fairly, and came home in time to make dinner and check homework. His reputation in the city's small classic car community was quiet but solid. People who knew the industry knew his name. People who didn't know the industry looked at his garage and saw a man in work clothes. That was usually the end of the assessment. The night after the auction, after Grace was asleep, Lucas pulled a wooden box from under her bed, one she knew was there, and had been told not to open without him. Inside the box was a black and white photograph, printed on paper that had softened at the edges with age. It showed a man in his late 20s standing beside a car in front of a garage, somewhere flat and dry, Oklahoma, from the look of the sky. The car in the photograph was a Ford Mustang Fastback. The paint, even in black and white, had the quality of something that absorbed light rather than reflected it, something deep and deliberate. The man standing beside it had his hand on the roof and was squinting slightly into the sun. He looked like someone who had earned something and was not yet used to having it. The man was Joseph Hartley, Lucas's grandfather. The year was 1969. Lucas had been carrying the vehicle documentation that went with the photograph for 3 years. The original title, the build sheet, the window sticker, with the factory paint code printed in faded ink. The paint code read, Acapulco Blue. The vehicle identification number on those documents matched the number on the frame of Lot 22 at the Westfield auction. He had confirmed the match from the auction catalog before he drove to Westfield. He had known what he was going there to buy before he walked through the door. This was not a random Mustang. This was his grandfather's car. Joseph had sold it in 1988, during a year when the family needed the money more than they needed the car. He had spoken of it rarely, and only in the specific way that people speak about the things they have given up, that they wish they hadn't briefly, with a shift in the eyes, before changing the subject. He had never said he regretted it. He had never had to. Grace stirred in the doorway. She had come for a glass of water and found her father sitting at the kitchen table with an old photograph and several sheets of yellowed paper. "Is that the car?" she asked. "That's the car." "Is it Grandpa's car?" It was. A long time ago. Lucas set the photograph down. "I'm going to make it right again." She considered this with the full seriousness of a 7-year-old who had been taught that mechanical problems had mechanical solutions. "Can you fix it, though?" It looked pretty broken. "Everything's fixable," he said. "You just have to know where to start." The next morning, a flatbed tow truck pulled the Mustang into Lucas's garage on Clement Street. A few neighbors paused on the sidewalk to watch the unloading. The car looked worse in daylight, the peeling paint more extensive, the chrome trim oxidized to a flat gray, the roof panel warped at the rear seam. Aaron Mills pulled up in his truck 20 minutes later. Aaron was 38, built wide through the shoulders, and had worked alongside Lucas at Hollowell for 2 years before Lucas left. He ran his own upholstery and trim shop across town now. He walked around the Mustang twice without speaking, crouched to look under the frame, and then stood up. "You're serious," he said. "30 days," Lucas said. Aaron looked at him. 30 days. From this, 30 days. Aaron looked at the car again. Then he took off his jacket and hung it on the garage wall. "I'm here on weekends, and I won't take money for it." Lucas spent the entire first day doing nothing but looking. He moved around the car slowly, pressing his fingers against panels, lifting sections of trim to check what was beneath, testing each door hinge for play. This was how he had always started, not with tools but with attention. The assessment had to come first. The work had to know where it was going before it began. What he found changed the picture considerably. The chassis was sound. Not merely acceptable, genuinely sound. No bending in the frame rails, no meaningful corrosion in the structural members. For a car that had been sitting undisturbed for more than 2 decades, it was the kind of discovery that a restorer recognized as rare, without needing to say it out loud. The body panels were a different story. Surface rust, deformation in the right quarter panel, and paint failure everywhere. But the skeleton beneath was honest. The engine was a Vate 390 cubic inch FE block, one of the more powerful options Ford had offered on the '67 Fastback. It had been neglected comprehensively. The carburetor was gummed past cleaning. The valve cover gaskets had failed. The timing chain had slackened. But when Lucas removed the valve covers and looked inside, the cylinder walls were not scored. The block had not cracked. It was a damaged engine, not a dead one. He found the note when he removed the instrument cluster, tucked behind the dash panel, folded once, written in ballpoint pen that had bled slightly into the paper over the years. Oklahoma, 1969. J. Hartley. Lucas stood still for a long time with the folded paper in his hand. Then he put it in his wallet, next to his driver's license. He called his grandfather that evening. Joseph answered on the 3rd ring, voice careful the way it always was when he wasn't sure who was calling. "I found it," Lucas said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Lucas checked the connection. Then his grandfather said very quietly, "Where?" "Westfield, Kentucky, before that. I don't know the whole path, but it's here." Another silence. Then, "Is it bad?" "It's bad," Lucas said, "but it's all there." Grace had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room by the time he finished the call. He carried her to bed, set her down carefully, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her, the small, steady rise and fall of her breathing, the purple marker still held loosely in one hand. He went back to the kitchen and wrote out the schedule on a legal pad. 5 days of full disassembly, 3 days of cleaning, cataloging, and assessment, 10 days of parts sourcing and mechanical rebuild, 7 days of body work, 4 days of paint, 2 days of interior and trim, 2 days of final assembly, systems check, and road test. 30 days. The math was possible. It would not be comfortable, but it was possible. The parts would be the difficult part. Original specification components for a 1967 Mustang were available, but sourcing the correct pieces took time that the schedule did not generously allow. Lucas called 3 suppliers that first night and left messages with 2 others. He had accounts from his Hollowell years that were still active, and a reputation that the suppliers recognized when he used his name. By the end of the second day, he had commitments for the engine components, pistons, camshaft, valve train, crankshaft bearings, and a delivery window he could work within. On the 6th day, he drove to Callaway Auto Supply on the north side of Ashford to source gaskets and a carburetor rebuild kit. The store was run by a man named Douglas Callaway, who had been selling parts to serious mechanics for 31 years and who recognized quality of work the way a librarian recognizes a careful reader by small signs that accumulate into certainty. Lucas was standing at the rack of Mustang components when a woman came through the door behind him. He heard the door, registered the sound, and continued reading the specifications on a parts box. Isabella Crane stood at the counter and spoke with Douglas about a display component for the launch event of Crane Automotive's new heritage-inspired sedan, a piece she wanted sourced to a period-accurate specification for a promotional photograph. She was precise about what she needed and spoke without hesitation, the cadence of someone used to being the clearest person in any room. Douglas answered her questions and then looked past her at Lucas. "You know," he said, in the easy way of someone who has held a conversation in his store for 3 decades and sees no reason to stop, the gentleman looking at the Mustang rack there restored vehicles for the Smithsonian and Christie's London, among other places. Isabella turned. She looked at Lucas for the first time, the way one professional looks at another, as a fact to be assessed rather than a detail to be dismissed. Lucas was reading the back of a carburetor kit and had not fully turned around. He nodded at Douglas. That was all. Isabella bought what she needed and left. On the sidewalk, she paused for a moment outside the glass door before walking to her car. She had not recognized him immediately at the counter, but she had recognized the name when Douglas said it. Hartley. She had heard that name in the context of restoration work once before, at a conference 2 years ago, in a conversation about the provenance requirements for a car that had sold at auction for more than $1.2 million. The work had been attributed to a restorer named Hartley from Hollowell Classic Works. She sat in her car for a moment, then drove back to the office. That afternoon, she asked her assistant to pull whatever professional record existed for a Lucas Hartley, formerly of Hollowell Classic Works, currently in Ashford. What came back was a career summary that did not match the man she had seen at the Westfield auction, the Smithsonian project, the Christie's documentation, a private collection in Monaco, a completed restoration that had been assessed by an independent evaluator and described, in a formal report she pulled up on her screen, as technically and historically the most faithful work of its kind completed in the last 15 years. Sebastian Voss stopped in her doorway in the late afternoon. He had heard, through someone at the convention hall, that the man from the auction was actually working on the Mustang, that it was in a garage somewhere in Ashford. He laughed when he mentioned it. Isabella did not laugh. "Who is he?" she asked. Sebastian repeated what he had said. "A mechanic. A guy who bought a $500 car. Before that," Isabella said. "Who was he before that?" Sebastian didn't know. He left without pressing the point, reading something in her expression that suggested the conversation was over. Isabella looked at the career summary on her screen for another moment. Then she closed it and went back to her work. The weeks that followed inside Lucas's garage on Clement Street were the kind of weeks that don't announce themselves as significant while they are happening. They were made of early mornings and late nights, and the particular silence of a man doing a thing he knows how to do very well without an audience. Grace came to the garage after school each afternoon and did her homework on a folding table near the rear wall, occasionally looking up to ask the name of a component or to offer an observation that she delivered with complete seriousness. "The door panel color is wrong," she said on a Wednesday evening during the second week, holding a paint chip she had found on the floor next to the passenger door. Lucas looked at the chip. "What color do you think it should be?" "Blue," she said. "Like in Grandpa's picture. Darker blue, like the ocean at nighttime." He looked at her. That's exactly right. The paint was the problem he had anticipated most. Acapulco blue, the factory color listed on Joseph Hartley's original build sheet, had been a Mustang option for model years 1967 and 68. Ford's original mixing formula existed in technical documentation, but the dyes had shifted since the 1960s, and no commercial paint supplier in Ashford could match the reference chip Lucas had pulled from the original catalog with sufficient accuracy. He called 3 specialty shops in 2 different cities. None of them could hit the formula precisely enough. He spent one evening pulling out a binder he had kept from his Hollowell years, a collection of technical documents, factory color specifications, and mixing ratios that he had assembled over nearly a decade of restoration work. The Acapulco blue formula was on page 47, cross-referenced against a DuPont product code that had been discontinued in 1991. With the formula, the archived colorimetry data, and a spectrophotometer that Aaron borrowed from a colleague in the automotive finishing trade, Lucas mixed the paint himself over 2 days of trial and adjustment. When he held the test panel next to the black and white photograph, reading the depth of the finish against the tonal quality of the image, the match was as close as a photograph could confirm. Aaron picked up the test panel, held it at arm's length, and did not speak for a long moment. "Lucas," he finally said. "Yeah, Isabella Crane is going to see this car at some point. You know that." Lucas didn't answer. He was already setting up the spray booth. The engine came together during the second and third weeks in the way that complex mechanical work comes together when the person doing it has done it many times, not without difficulty, but without uncertainty. Lucas replaced every component that needed replacing and reconditioned every component that could be reconditioned to original specification. The 390 FE block was cleaned, honed, and reassembled with care that would not have been visible to a casual observer, but that would be audible to anyone who listened to the engine run. On the 14th evening, he turned the key in the ignition for the first time. The engine caught after 2 attempts a rough, uneven idle that stabilized over the course of 40 seconds into something steadier. It was not yet correct. The carburetor needed adjustment. The timing was slightly off, but it was running. A 60-year-old engine that had not started in more than 2 decades was running in a garage on Clement Street in Ashford at 11:40 in the evening. Aaron put his hands on top of his head and looked at the ceiling. Grace, who had fallen asleep on the folding table with her cheek on her homework, lifted her head at the sound. "Did the car say something?" she asked, blinking. Lucas looked over at her. "It said it remembered us." She accepted this without skepticism, laid her head back down, and returned to sleep. The bodywork ran from day 15 through day 22. The right quarter panel was the most demanding section. The deformation required heating, reforming, and multiple rounds of finish work before the surface met the standard that Lucas applied to everything. Run your hand across it in low light with your eyes closed, and if you feel anything, do it again. The rust treatment was methodical. The primer application was done in 3 stages. No step was skipped because the schedule was tight, which it was. On day 26, the Acapulco Blue went on. Lucas sprayed the first coat in the afternoon and the second coat the following morning. The color came down over the bodywork, the way a fact settles after it has been confirmed, not as a surprise, but as a recognition. The deep blue with its slight metallic element in the formula caught light the way the original had caught it in 1967, the way it had caught it when Joseph Hartley stood beside it in Oklahoma and squinted into the sun. Aaron arrived on day 27 for the buffing and final surface work. He walked into the garage, stopped in the doorway, and stood there without speaking for nearly a full minute. "Say something," Lucas said. "I'm trying to find a word," Aaron said. "Give me a minute." The interior was the final stage. Lucas had sourced period-correct materials for the seat upholstery, a close match to the original black vinyl that Ford had used in the '67 Fastback, and had installed the replacement door panels, carpet, and dashboard components over the course of 3 days. The instrument cluster went back in last. Before he secured it, he looked at the back panel, the one that had been in this car since it left the factory in Dearborn, the one that had been in this car when Joseph Hartley drove it out of the dealership in Oklahoma City in the spring of 1967. The carving was still there, where he had left it. J. Hartley. He did not restore it. He did not polish over it, or fill it, or treat it as a flaw to be corrected. He cleaned the area around it with careful attention and put the instrument cluster back in place, with the carved initials exactly where they had always been. On day 29, a letter arrived from the Ashford Vintage Automotive Showcase, the city's largest annual classic car exhibition, held every year at Ashford Convention Park. The letter was from the event's organizing board. It said that the showcase would be held the following Saturday, and that a display position had been reserved for an exceptional vehicle recently brought to their attention. It invited Lucas to present the car in the central exhibition space, which was typically allocated by committee selection rather than open application. Lucas read the letter twice. Then he showed it to Grace, who was eating cereal at the kitchen table. "They want to see our car," she said. "Looks like it. Is it ready?" Lucas looked toward the garage door. Almost. He did not know who had contacted the showcase on his behalf. He did not ask. What he did not know, and would not learn until much later, was that Isabella Crane had placed that call herself 2 days after she had pulled up his professional record and read the evaluator's report from the Monaco collection. She had contacted the board through an intermediary and had suggested, without pressure, that a vehicle of unusual historical and technical interest might warrant a central display slot. She had not mentioned her connection to the Westfield auction. She had not told Sebastian, or her assistant, or anyone at Crane Automotive Group. She had picked up the phone, made the call, and gone back to her work. On the final night, Lucas and Aaron finished the last adjustments, the idle mixture, the timing advance, the the final torque check on the suspension components at 2:15 in the morning. Both men were past tired. Lucas sat down on the garage floor with his back against the tool cabinet, and Aaron sat across from him near the door, and neither of them spoke for a while. The Mustang stood in the center of the garage under the overhead lights, the Acapulco blue paint holding the light with the same unhurried depth it had held in 1967. Every surface was right. Every line was where it was supposed to be. From the chrome-trimmed fastback roofline to the re-chromed front grille, from the correctly period fog lamp bezels to the blacked-out rear panel, the car was as faithful to its original specification as 30 years of restoration experience could make it in 30 days. Aaron picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. He stood looking at the car for a long moment before he put it on. 30 days, he said, from $500 worth of scrap. Lucas, do you understand what you've done here? Lucas looked at the car. He looked at the photograph of Joseph Hartley that he had taped to the garage wall 3 weeks earlier, still there, slightly curled at one corner. I brought it home, he said. He carried Grace to bed an hour later. She had woken when the garage light went off and had asked, in the fog of interrupted sleep, whether the car was finished. All done, he said. We're going to show it tomorrow. Good, she said, and was asleep again before he set her down. The Saturday morning arrived clear and dry, with the kind of October light that is useful to photographers and kind to paint finishes. Ashford Convention Park occupied 6 acres on the northern edge of the city, and by 8 in the morning the grounds were already arranged with more than 80 vehicles, sports cars, touring cars, pre-war roadsters, muscle cars from the 1960s and 70s, all presented on clean asphalt under white canopy frames. Lucas drove the Mustang from Clement Street to the park himself. This was the first time the car had moved under its own power on a public road since before Grace was born. The 390 Vate sounded the way it was built to sound, a low, unhurried authority that other drivers noticed when they passed, turning their heads at an intersection or slowing briefly on the on-ramp. Grace sat in the passenger seat in a denim jacket with her hair in a high ponytail, holding the 1969 photograph in her lap with both hands. It's the loudest car on the road, she said. It's a big engine, Lucas said. I like it, she said. The staff at the event entrance directed Lucas to the central exhibition space, a position at the exact geometric center of the grounds, where the walkways from all 4 entry points converged. He had not been told in advance that this was where he was going. He pulled in and turned off the engine, and in the moment of silence after the motor stopped, a man standing 20 feet away turned to look at the car, and then the man next to him turned, and within 2 minutes, there were a dozen people in a loose arc around the Mustang, without anyone having said anything to organize them. Grace got out of the car and stood next to the front fender, holding the photograph. An older collector, a man in his late 60s named Raymond Aldis, who had been attending the showcase for 19 of its 22 years, and who had been present at the Hollowell Classic Works workshop twice, when Lucas was running restoration there, walked up and looked at the car with quiet, thorough attention of someone who has looked at a great many cars and has learned to distinguish between the ones that have been made to look good and the ones that have been made right. He crouched at the rear quarter panel. He stood and walked to the front. He opened the hood and stood looking at the engine bay for a long time. Then he straightened up, looked at Lucas, and extended his hand. Lucas Hartley, I wondered what you were doing with yourself. He paused. Now I know. A reporter from the Ashford Times was on the grounds covering the showcase for the weekend culture section. She had received a tip the day before from someone in the collector community that a notable vehicle might be on display, one with a connection to a story that had been circulating in automotive circles since the Westfield auction. She found the Mustang by following the congregation of people. She took photographs and then stood next to Grace, who was explaining the car's history to a boy about her age, with the authority of someone who had heard the facts stated precisely and had retained them precisely. This was my great-grandfather's car, Grace said. He bought it in 1967. My dad found it and fixed it. It took 30 days. The color is called Acapulco Blue. The boy nodded seriously. What's Acapulco? Grace considered this. A very blue place, she said. Isabella Crane arrived at the showcase at 10:45, later than she had planned. She came in the capacity of Crane Automotive Group's executive representative. The company was a presenting sponsor of the event, and she moved through the grounds with her assistant and 2 members of her communications team. She had attended the showcase before. She knew what the vehicles typically looked like, how the crowds typically distributed themselves, what the energy of the event typically felt like. The central exhibition space was not typical today. From 40 yards out, she could see the crowd larger and more concentrated than any other cluster on the grounds, arranged around a single vehicle. She moved toward it. The crowd parted naturally as she approached, the way crowds part for someone who carries themselves with executive certainty. Then the crowd parted enough for her to see the car. The Acapulco blue stopped her. Not the color itself, though the color was extraordinary in the morning light, exactly the depth and quality that the 1967 specification intended, and that most modern attempts at the formula failed to reach. What stopped her was the whole of it. The proportions of the fastback roofline against the restored body, the chrome reglinting with the clarity of something new. The engine bay she could see through the open hood, the 390 block sitting clean and precise in the engine bay, as though it had been assembled yesterday rather than rebuilt in a garage 30 days ago. She had seen the car at Westfield. She remembered exactly what it had looked like. The peeling paint, the cracked windshield, the bumper hanging at an angle, the general appearance of something that had given up. What stood in front of her now occupied the same physical space in her understanding, but was otherwise a completely different object. Not restored, returned. Returned to something it had been, with complete technical fidelity, by someone who knew what he was doing, to a degree she had not paused to consider when she saw him at Westfield with his work clothes and his daughter on his shoulders. Sebastian Voss was standing to her left. He had seen the car and then seen Lucas standing near it, and he had not said anything since. Isabella walked forward through the remaining space between herself and the car. Lucas saw her from about 10 steps away. He did not move away. He did not change his expression or posture. He simply stood and waited, the way he had waited when the gavel came down at Westfield. She stopped in front of the hood. She looked at the car from the nose to the tail, a slow, complete look that took the measure of everything. Then she looked at Lucas. "How long?" she said. 30 days. From the car at Westfield? Yes. There was a pause. Grace moved closer to her father, looking up at Isabella with a frank, uncomplicated curiosity. Isabella looked at the child for a moment. "I said something at the auction," Isabella said. Her voice had changed register from the one she used in meetings. Less edge in it, more directness. It was unkind, to you and to her. She looked at Grace. "I'm sorry." Lucas nodded once. He didn't expand on it, didn't accept it with language designed to close the distance more quickly than the distance warranted closing. He nodded, and the nod was sufficient. Grace said, with perfect sincerity, "That's okay. Dad said mean words usually come from people who haven't looked closely enough yet." Isabella looked at the child. Something shifted in her face that was not quite a smile, and not quite something else. It was the expression of someone receiving a correction they had not expected from the direction it came. The showcase's panel of judges made their announcements at noon, under the main canopy near the entrance. The crowd gathered around the podium, in the way crowds gather for the conclusion of things they have invested a morning in attending. The award for Best in Show went to the 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, Central Exhibition Space, owner Lucas Hartley. The award for Best Restoration went to the same vehicle. The panel's spokesperson read the citation into the microphone, a complete restoration from non-operational condition, executed in 30 days, using period-correct components and historically faithful techniques, representing the highest standard of work the panel had encountered in the event's 22-year history. The applause started at the edges of the crowd and moved inward. Grace jumped and grabbed her father's hand with both of hers. Lucas stood with his arms at his sides, looking at the podium, and then looking at the photograph she was still holding his grandfather at 29, beside the same car, in a different decade, in the same unassuming posture of a man who had earned something and wasn't yet used to having it. Aaron had driven to Oklahoma City the previous Thursday and had said nothing about where he was going. He had told Lucas only that he had an errand and would be back by Saturday morning. He arrived at the showcase just before noon, with a passenger, a man of 67, with silver hair and a cane, who moved slowly across the asphalt in dress shoes that were slightly wrong for the occasion, but had been polished that morning with evident care. Joseph Hartley came through the edge of the crowd and stopped when the car came into view. He stood still for a long time, long enough that people nearby began to notice him and step back, creating space without being asked. He moved forward slowly, raised his hand, and placed it flat on the hood of the Mustang directly over the engine, directly where a man places his hand when the thing he is touching is something he has thought about for a long time. His eyes were red at the edges. Grace ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Grandpa, that's your car. Dad fixed it. It took 30 days. Joseph Hartley held his granddaughter with one arm and kept his other hand on the hood of the car. He could not speak for a moment. When he could, what he said was quiet enough that only the people immediately surrounding him heard it. "I know, sweetheart," he said. "I know." Lucas stood beside his grandfather and said nothing. There was nothing that required saying. The car was there. The three of them were there. That was the complete statement. Isabella watched from a respectful distance. Her assistant started to say something, and she raised one hand slightly, a quiet signal that meant not now. She watched Joseph Hartley's hand on the hood of the car and said nothing. Sebastian Voss had left the grounds 40 minutes earlier. He had shaken no one's hand on the way out. Later in the afternoon, when the formal presentations were finished and the crowd had thinned to the steady drift of people who stay until the end of events out of genuine interest, Isabella found Lucas standing near the front of the Mustang, while Grace sat in the passenger seat, explaining the instrument gauges to Raymond Aldous through the open window. "I'd like to talk to you about something," Isabella said, "when you have time for it." Lucas waited. "Crane Automotive is moving into a heritage division," she said. "Classic car restoration and certification. We have the capital and the client base. We don't have the expertise." She paused, and the pause had the quality of someone being more careful than they usually are. "I think I found it today." Lucas looked at her steadily. "What would the work look like?" "That's what I'd want to discuss. On your terms." He was quiet for a moment. He looked across the hood of the Mustang at his grandfather, who was sitting in the driver's seat now, his hands resting on the original steering wheel, looking through the windshield at nothing in particular with an expression that had no name for it except peace. "My terms include being in Ashford," Lucas said, "and being home by dinner." "I understand that," Isabella said. "Then we can talk," he said. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said they could talk, and that was the appropriate answer for the moment, measured and honest and uncommitted to anything except the conversation. By late afternoon, the Ashford Convention Park had the quiet of an event, winding down, folding tables being broken apart, car owners doing final photographs, the October sun pushing long shadows across the asphalt. The Mustang sat in the central space in the last of the afternoon light, the Acapulco blue taking on a slightly warmer quality as the angle of the sun changed. The color held its depth the same way at 4 in the afternoon as it had at 10 in the morning, which was the mark of paint that had been done correctly. Aaron drove alongside Lucas on the way back to Clement Street. Grace fell asleep against the passenger window before they reached the first intersection, the photograph of Joseph Hartley still in her lap, her hand resting on it lightly. Joseph rode in Aaron's truck, looking out at the streets of Ashford in the early evening. Lucas drove in the particular silence of a man at the end of a thing he has completed. The engine ran beneath him with the steady, unhurried authority he had rebuilt it to have. He listened to it the way he had always listened to engines, finding in the sound not just the mechanical information but the confirmation that the work had been done the way it was supposed to be done. He thought about what Isabella had said at Westfield. $500. Pile of scrap. The words had not been kind and had not been intended to be, but they had been, in some unintentional way, useful not as motivation in the performative sense, but as a kind of clarity. On the 12th day, when the engine had failed to start for the third time and Aaron had gone home and Grace was asleep and the garage felt very large and the schedule felt very short, it had been that clarity, the certainty of what he was doing, and why that had kept his hands moving. There were things that got undervalued, not because they lacked worth, but because the person doing the valuation hadn't looked long enough or hard enough or carefully enough. The car was one of those things. He had always suspected that he might be one of them too. He turned onto Clement Street. The garage light was still on. Aaron must have left it on when he picked up Joseph that morning. The door was open, and the light fell out across the driveway in a rectangle, and Lucas pulled the Mustang into it and cut the engine. The silence after the engine stopped was the good kind. The kind that happens when something that has been running the way it should be running finally rests. He sat for a moment in the driver's seat. Then he got out, lifted Grace from the passenger side without waking her, and carried her toward the house. At the door, he turned back once. Joseph was standing beside the car in the garage, his hand on the roof, not moving, not speaking, just standing the way you stand beside something you had given up and then received back with the specific stillness of someone who does not want to rush the moment because they understand that some moments do not arrive twice. The car was home. The man who had brought it home went inside. The garage light stayed on a little longer.